Good evening, CFP. Welcome to the 7th lecture in our Perspective series in Introduction to the Arts and Social Sciences. Before we begin, I'd like to thank the Dean Samir Shah, the program chairs, Kat and Vishal, and the CEP logistics team, Dhruvika, Judith, Nupur, and the IT department for their help in putting these lectures together. A huge thank you to Hussain Indorewala for accepting our invitation. He teaches urban planning, housing, and humanities at the Kamla Raheja Vidyanidhi Institute for Architecture. His research work has focused on urban politics and ideology, planning epistemology, urban history, and urban political economy. Today's talk, Fall of the Public City, focuses on the socio-geographical transformation of the structure and fabric of cities that have posed significant social and conceptual challenges. We will discuss the changing conception of the Indian city and the possible roles for future practitioners of the built environment. Thanks.
Hi. Hello, everyone. My name is Hussain. First of all, I would like to thank everybody, your faculty, for inviting me over. I can see that the pattern of seating is very typical, as far away from the speaker as possible. I mean, luckily there are more people in the middle, otherwise they would be like as far away in the corners as possible. Because of the first few years of design school. I'm going to speak today about something that I teach and some things that I also research and like to talk about as well. And I also think is of concern ought to be of concern to many of us. The concept is one of the public city. Now you may wonder what that is, and essentially that is what I'm going to talk about. So how many of you have heard of this phrase, public goods? Raise your hands. Anyone wants to volunteer to explain what it is? Doesn't have to be the right answer. Anything, just your intuition about it or what you think you know about it. Anyone? Public goods? You've heard the term, so maybe you know what it means. Or give an example. If you can't articulate it as a definition, that's fine as well. Public goods? Any example? Milk. Milk is a public good? Huh? It's used by the public. Is that, oh well, then everything is used by the public in some sense, right? But then that can't be right. Everything can't be a public good. There are private goods as well. So then what's the difference? Public toilets, getting somewhere. Why do we, okay. Owned by the government? Something that is owned by the government. That's one way of understanding it, yes. Okay, that's fine. I mean, you know, most people have a very ambiguous conception of what a public good is. So let's see. I don't know how many of you have been to an economics class, but if you have been, and you know, very soon you will have to define the term public goods if you open an economics textbook. And this is the kind of diagram that you'll see. So it's very simple. Economists like clarity. They don't like ambiguity. Ambiguity confuses them, and they think they're doing science, so they want clear ideas and concepts. So this is how they define it. On the one side, you have something called rivalrous and non-rivalrous, meaning, very simply, what we mean by, you know, if I have something, you don't have it, right? That is rivalry, okay? And excludable and non-excludable, which means, can I exclude you from having something, or can I not exclude you from having something? Or is it impossible for me to exclude you from having something? So for example, take air. Can I stop you from getting access to air? It's very difficult. It may be possible, but it's very difficult. I mean, I can pull you the hell out of the atmosphere, and then probably sell clean air to you. That's a business model. But otherwise, it's difficult to exclude people from breathing, right? Rivalry and non-rivalry, well, anything, like take an example of a street light. If I am standing under a street light and reading something, and you come under that street light as well, my standing there doesn't take away your light, does it? So there is not too much rivalry there. We can both coexist under the street light, right? But if I am wearing this pair of shoes, you don't have it. That's rivalry, right? So economists say that if you have a situation where something is both rivalrous and excludable, it's a candidate for putting on the market, right? Like shoes, cars, phones, etc. If you have a situation where something is rivalrous but non-excludable, it's club goods, which means you can put it on the market, but it's of a different character, right? So for instance, a cinema hall, where you are essentially not excluded, but at the same time, it is also rivalrous, right? And so on. But if you look at public goods, you come to a particular situation. Public goods are those goods which are non-rivalrous and non-excludable, like air, right? Like sunlight. But there are, now, who has made this definition? I mean, the point of the question, I mean, showing you this graph is not to tell you what the right answer to public goods is, but it is to ask you, who has made this graph? The economists, right? Economists like to tell you what should belong to the market and what should not, okay? By this definition, almost everything can be marketized, can be sold on the market. Almost everything. So take education. Okay, you can have education which is privately provided in the marketplace, right? You can have water. How many of you use private water? Not drinking water, the one you use in your house. You all use water from the public authority, right? Does anyone have a problem with that? Who wants competition in water suppliers? Anybody wants competition in water suppliers? Why? When I open my tap, I get water. You know, I don't care who is providing it. I pay my taxes, I get my water. Actually, even if you don't pay taxes, you get water. That is why it is a public good, right? Now, the problem with this diagram is that it's made by economists, and economists like to make you think that everything can be provided by the market. So, if you study this diagram carefully, you arrive at three conclusions. One, that it is difficult to make money from public goods. Like I told you, it's difficult to make money from air. You have to pollute everything and then sell clean air. In other words, where does profit come from if you're a business person? From excluding people and from creating rivalrous situations. That is the only way to make profit. Otherwise, you can't make money. Have you seen any businessman trying to sell you things if you can't pay for them? Giving you things even if you can't pay for them? No, they don't do it. But if you are not paying your taxes, you can still use water, right? That is what a public good is. Okay, the second conclusion they can draw from it is public goods are those things that cannot be provided profitably through the market because it's difficult to commodify them. And third, whatever public goods, therefore what public goods are is determined, ironically, not by the public, but by economists or by the market. The market will tell you what should be and should not be public goods, not the public. Okay, clearly there's something wrong. Now there's a side note here. What is the problem with markets? You know, you can have markets in certain things, like shoes, for instance. Okay, you like Nike, I like Adidas, who cares, right? But a water system, not necessarily. So markets serve only those who can pay, the rest they ignore. And markets value only what can be priced. The other things are exploited. So markets cannot value, for instance, a a good environment, which is why we are on the verge of a climate catastrophe, right? It is a market externality, it's called, when we have done so many things in the market system that has created an environmental crisis, and the market still can't price it, that is the reason it is not valued, right? So till you price something, you don't value it in a marketplace. So these are some of the problems with the market system, okay? Let's move ahead. Now, when we talk about public goods, usually they're counterposed with a concept called privatization. Now, privatization, we know what privatization means. For instance, when you convert something which was earlier in the realm of public goods into now what is in the realm of a market system. That is essentially what we term as privatization. We've also heard another term very often, public-private partnerships. Now, if you look at public-private partnerships, essentially they mean privatization. You know, it's just a word that seems less offensive than privatization. So they use the word public-private partnership. Actually, everything is public-private partnership in one sense or the other, right? But still, it is used because the public can bear the cost and the private partner can benefit from it financially, right? That's why it's called public-private partnership. Anyway, so what I'm going to do now is, with this background, I'm going to talk about three things in the city which are being increasingly privatized, okay? First is infrastructure, then is housing, and the third will be public space, okay? So first, infrastructure. You know this project in Mumbai? Okay, a large part of this presentation will be based on the experience of Mumbai because I am from there, but a lot of it applies to whichever city you come from, in whichever part of the world, essentially, right? So you know this project in Bombay, the big ticket project. It's on every Mumbai poster. It's become a symbol of the city, the Bandra Worli Sea Link, right? Now, if you place an order for a particular, you buy something on Amazon, and they tell you, you will have, let's say you buy, I don't know, something, I don't know, 1 dozen pairs of shoes, and they send you only 4. What do you do? Will you say, okay, no problem, I'll keep the 4? What will you do? You send it back, isn't it? You'll send it back, say, this is not what I asked for, send it back. It's not the right order. It's not the right quantity. The quality is bad, something or the other. You will send it back, right? Now, what do you do with infrastructure that promises something and doesn't deliver? What do you do with it? You can't send it back. You live with it. So this project was estimated to cost 400 crores. It eventually costed 1,600 crores. It was estimated to move 100,000 passengers per day. It still moves only 37,000 passengers per day. So what is it? It is a planning failure, right? Can you send it back? No. You live with it. Now, who should be accountable for planning failures like this? Right? Nobody is accountable. But it's a nice postcard image of Mumbai city, right? So now you multiply this with any number of projects that are being built in the city. Free coastal road, freeways, flyovers, metro systems. You can go on and on. Series and series of planning failures. But you can't send them all back. You have to live with them, right? So, Mumbai's transport system. You know, there is, when you do transport planning, you have a planning department here. There are planners who do transport, who specialize in transport planning. If you show them this graph, they will be shocked. You know why? Every city in the world tries to move this graph in the opposite direction, okay? At some point in 1998, oh, there is a pointer here, 1 second. Can you see this dot? This one? Okay, in 1998, 74% plus 4.8, so almost 79% of the city's transportation was over public transport, which is the railway system and buses, right? It has declined to 72.9 plus 5, and in 2018, it came down to 60%. And by 2024, it's going to be 59%. So what has happened? The ridership, the modal share as it's called, of public transport has declined dramatically in the city. Every city in the world tries to move it up. In fact, the targets are always try to reach 80% public transport, not more than 20% private transport. And even if you reach 80%, you still try to push higher. Why? Public transport is more sustainable. It's more environment friendly, right? It's cheaper, it's more affordable, and it's also more practical. There's less congestion if people move on public transport. It makes a lot of sense. You know, just imagine, in a car, what is the average passenger count? Usually it's 1.2. That is how much you count when you're counting car passenger usage. Most of the cars that we use are empty, most of it. It takes up so much road space and moves very few passengers. It's the most impractical device invented by human beings to move people. Trains were great, buses are great, right? Now, if you bring down the share of these things, it's a problem. But this is what is happening in the city. Why? Well, one explanation given is that people like to buy cars because they have money. Okay? But a better explanation, which seems to work, you know, it seems to explain things better, is that we are building more roads. And therefore, people have an incentive to buy cars. If you have a nice road that is being built outside your house, even if you didn't have a car, you'll buy one. Right? But if you had a metro outside your house, or a railway station, or a bus stop, and a good bus connectivity, you take the bus. It depends on what choices do you have. If the choices are constrained in terms of private transport, people buy cars. It's as simple as that. So in Bombay, there have been lots of transport projects like this one, the coastal road. Reclaimed road, you know, 10 kilometers, the most expensive road in the world, I guess. You know how much it costs? So this is the road, the red thing that you see. It's mostly reclamation. The road is, it's 120 hectares, and the road is about 10, 12 hectares or something. So a large part of it is land, not road, but it is called a coastal road project, right? Anyway, so what are the numbers for this project? In 2011, when they proposed this project, it was going to cost 8,000 crores for 35 kilometers, right? So the cost per kilometer is 222 crores. It's a lot, right? In 2015, they came up with a detailed report. In that, they said 34 kilometers will cost 12,200 crores or 300 crores. So the cost went up to 327. What they are building today is a 10-kilometer road, only this part, only this section, which itself cost 13,000 crores. It's gone even more up. It's gone now 13,500 crores. What is the cost per kilometer? 1,316 crores. It's the most expensive road in the world. How many people it's going to move per day? The ceiling I said was 1 lakh persons per day, estimated. It moves 33,000 people. This is expected to move 60,000 people per day. 60. So if it goes, I mean, it'll be half probably. So for 30,000 people, it's going to move, you're spending 13,500 crores. You know how many zeros there are in 13,000 crores? Anyway, even I get confused. I have to count it 5 times. Anyway, so this is the report card, right? So Bandra Worli Sea Link, how much, what is the private vehicle usage? Most of these projects are for car owners. They're not for public use. Because most of Mumbai travels by buses, by trains, by cycling, and by walking. They are not served by these projects. Now, what is the problem here? The problem is that if you look at the fuel cost for each of these modes of transport, you will find that the moving one person per kilometer on the railway system costs 25 paise. moving one person by a four-wheeler costs 5.5 rupees. This is in terms of fuel cost. Now, what does fuel cost translate to? Translates to emissions. Because what you're buying in terms of fuel, you are emitting in the atmosphere. So what does this mean? That a four-wheeler emits how many times more than a person traveling on a train? This is the story. This is the reason why Mumbai's air quality is getting worse than Delhi's, right? Anyway, so part 2 is housing. Now, this is a project in Mumbai, which I don't know if you know about. It's called the Mahol Resettlement Colony. This project was started in 2011. Construction started in 2011. You know what this is? This is the Bharat Petroleum Refinery. It's in Chembur, in the eastern suburbs of Mumbai. This is salt pans. This is your wetlands, basically mangroves. These are all industries. This is a highly polluted area. And there is a resettlement colony for 17,000 houses here, built here. You know the fun part of this project? That when it was built, for 7 or 8 years, not a single family lived here. It was not built as housing at all. It was built as something else. I'll tell you what it was. So, if you look at this project, it is planned. You can see it's planned, right? It's all organized in a grid and so on. But if you look at its planning provisions in terms of health, education, community spaces, open spaces, markets, etc., it is highly deficient based on the planning standards. It has none of these things, very few of them. So it is planned, but it is completely inadequate. If you see the pictures, you will also notice that it is insanitary, the sewage treatment plant doesn't work, the waste management doesn't work, nothing works here. It is a terrible place indeed, and to add to that, it is highly polluted. So it is completely unacceptable from the perspective of living standards, but it is planned. So how is this possible? We are taught that if you don't plan, you have chaos. But this is planned, but it's still very bad, right? So how is that possible? So the story is actually, we have to go back to early 1900s. In fact, 1896, there was a huge epidemic outbreak in Bombay, the plague. You know, the COVID pandemic, plague was much worse. Thousands and thousands of people died in the city, many fled the city. So what happened is, at that time they realized that one of the reasons why plague spreads in the city is due to the design of buildings. They're too close together, right? They're too close together. Why? Because the landlords are building too much. They're not giving enough space for light and ventilation, right? And so the planning authorities at that time, the Bombay Improvement Trust, introduced new planning regulations, which said that if you have two buildings, you have to keep a 63.5-degree angle between them, meaning that there should be enough space for light and sunlight and air to move through these buildings, which will prevent the infestation and the spread of disease and so on. And therefore, the Bombay Improvement Trust did a lot of this sanitary work. It demolished old insanitary buildings, introduced these bylaws and so on. These bylaws, you will be surprised, were opposed by landlords. Why? Because the landlord said, this is a restriction on our property rights. If you're telling us create this much distance between buildings, you're essentially telling us we can build less. We don't want it. You know, we want to build more. We want to build more houses in our land. So we don't accept this. So what they did is that you see this black line. This was a part of the city where they did not apply the new planning rules. They applied the planning rules in the rest of the city. In this part of the city, the old planning rules applied, so they could build more. If anyone from Bombay, you will see this is the part of what we call the was called the native town earlier. Now it is called the bazaar areas. It's called the inner city in Bombay, right? Which has the old municipal bylaws. Anyway, But the planning codes were introduced, 63.5-degree rule. So planning began in Bombay as a way of overcoming disease and epidemic outbreaks. Planning is actually, what is urban planning? It's an intervention in public health. Okay, it is not meant to make your urban environment look good. That too, but primarily it's an intervention in public health. Meaning better services, better infrastructure, more light and air, and better planning norms and so on, so that living standards and health, public health gets better. This is how planning began in India, okay, and in many parts of the world, incidentally. Most of your municipal services earlier were provided by the private sector. So for instance, did you know that the fire services were based on a subscription model? So there would be 5 fire agencies, okay, and you would subscribe to one of them. Now let's say your neighbor has not subscribed to any and his house catches fire. And there is a fire agency driving past and it sees that there's a house on fire. It will say, oh, they haven't subscribed to our services, so we are not putting out that fire. Right? So at some point, some people thought, well, this is not a good idea. It should be a public good. Anybody's house catches fire, somebody should come and put it out. Right? So a lot of these things began as private services. They were later municipalized. Right? So a lot of these municipal interventions became what we know as planning. Anyway, so in the post-independence, Bombay started building a lot of houses. Many of these were public housing, built by the public sector and so on. But they were very less. You see, the total is around 20,000. You know how much the demand was? 50,000. So what happened to the remaining 30,000? They built their own homes. That is how you have such large number of squatter settlements in Bombay, right? Okay, now if you go to the Slum Act, what does the Slum Act say about what is a slum? If I ask you what is a slum, you know what most people say when you ask them what is a slum? What is a slum? These days, the answer is encroachment, right? But what is encroachment? If you think about it, encroachment is not a term of sanitation or planning and so on. It is basically a property infringement. You have built a house on somebody else's land. If you look at the Slum Act definition, there is no mention of encroachment. It only talks about the conditions of housing, right? If your condition is inadequate, well, then it's a slum. You know what the funny thing is? A large part of Bombay, even which is not slum, should be considered slum according to this definition. But anyway, that's a side issue. We put it aside. So Bombay in the 60s and 70s built a lot of these large public housing projects. There's Motilal Nagar. This is Charkop Site and Services. They resulted in houses like this. You know, Samip Padora's exhibition is on right now on your campus. So this photograph is from his book. This is a Charkop Site and Services project. Basically, the idea was simple. People get their own plots. They build they have plots and they have services, and they build their own homes. And they become neighborhoods like this over time, right? So this was the way of addressing the slum problem in the city, okay? What is the way of addressing the slum problem in the city today? This. What is this? This is the SRA. Clear the land, stack everybody in these, you know, densely packed tenement blocks, and then release more land for sale, commercial or residential. So the developer, the private agency, it's a PPP project, public-private partnership, right? The public doesn't do anything in this. What happens is the developer uses the land, clears the land, uses part of the land for sale, and that profits, part of it goes into constructing houses for slum dwellers. The rest, basically, he makes money. The margins are huge. This is the way in which housing is being built. You know the funny thing about the SRA project? It breaks more houses than it rebuilds. Any SRA project. Because what is the idea? You only a certain number of people get entitlements, right? So if there are 100 houses, 60, 50 get entitled and are entitled for rehousing. The rest are simply evicted. So what has happened? You have reduced 50 houses rather than building more houses, right? So it's a net reduction of houses, not an increase, which is why the SRA even arithmetically cannot, rehouse all slum dwellers. But anyway, so now you get houses like this. What is the problem? It is the stark inequalities. You have lavish residential towers and penthouses like this, and you have rehabilitation blocks like this. So this is the way in which the approach towards housing has changed over time, from the public city to the city which is built on the PPP model. So earlier these were the MHADA and the site and services projects, mixed income, mixed use projects, lots of open spaces, amenities and so on. This is middle income, this is lower income, open space, little high income group as well. Now you have large resettlement blocks like this, only for displaced slum dwellers, right? In as many people as possible and as little land as possible. That is the idea, okay? So you get the, the photograph I showed you of Mahul in the beginning, that kind of housing. Now how does this happen? So this Mahul project was built here. I told you that for many years nobody lived there. You know why? Because this project was not built for housing. It was built for something called TDR. You know what TDR is? Anybody knows what TDR is? Transfer of development rights. It's basically an idea that if I am the developer, I build housing, what the state gives me is rights to build elsewhere. Okay? So I build housing here, and the state gives me the rights to build 1.33 times how much I built here somewhere else in higher land value areas. So I build this, give it to the government, and then I can build equivalent area elsewhere in Bandra, Andheri, and all of these places where I can sell it for 5, 6, 7, 8 times the property value of this, what I just built. So that is the model. So the builders who built this resettlement colony didn't care who is going to live there, whether people will live there at all. They just wanted the rights to build elsewhere. It's a kind of a compensation for doing something the government is supposed to do, right? Anyway, so eventually when people were settled here, they refused to go there because it was so polluted. And so the High Court said nobody can live here. But you know the funny thing, the developers who built this and the landowner who built this probably made about 10,000 crores through the TDR and this model. But nobody lives there anymore because the High Court said it's unlivable. So people made money, the government got houses on paper, but it is utterly useless, right? Anyway, the third is public space. Now, what we have in terms of public space is things like this. This is again a photograph from Sameer's book. This is Imperial Towers. This is the podium of the sale building. And this is the open spaces of the rehabilitation building. Earlier, this was a slum where everybody lived in ground plus 1, ground plus 2 story buildings. Now, this is a rehabilitation like this. But you see the inequality. On the one side, you have swimming pools and lawns. On the other side, you barely have enough light that enters the, this courtyard. Right? This is the kind of public spaces. And incidentally, these buildings are about 12 stories high. This podium is 12 stories high. So this podium is only for the people who live in this sale building. It's not public open space. So public open spaces are lifted off the ground, 8 stories of parking. On top of that, you have some green open space only for the people who live there. What was the earlier conception of public space? Public space is for everyone, not only for people who can pay for them, right? Okay. So, streets, a very important institution. Streets are where most of your rights as citizens were won, right? Your rights as citizens came from where? From the Constitution. Where was the Constitution fought for? On the streets, right? Okay, so what happens to streets? This is a street in Dadar. This is an old street in Dadar, right? You see the section, I don't know, some of you are going to be architecture students, some of you are going to be urban design students, but most of you are design students, so you can read a drawing, right? Okay, so this is a street section. You see, this is the shop. There is enough pavement space for the street vendor. There are trees which shade the pedestrians and the street vendors. Okay, then you have the carriageway, and the same thing happens on the other side. What is the height of the building? Ground plus 2, ground plus 3 max. What is the relationship between this building and the street? All of these balconies here will overlook the street. So there is an interaction between the street and the residents who are living in the 2 and 3 story buildings. Okay, there is, you can literally talk to the people. Okay, this is the street structure, this street section. This is Dadar. Give you another example. This is the Dadar Fool Market outside the Dadar station. Here you see again ground plus 2, ground plus 3, shops on the carriageway, a lot of pedestrians. Basically pedestrians have taken over the whole street. The cars and autos literally, there are no autos here, but cars literally struggle to, move around here. It is the pedestrian traffic which is essentially the traffic on the street. Okay? And then you have again pavements, shops. It's an extremely vibrant bazaar. All the time it is like this. And it is never desolate. Even at night you will see some or the other activity because it's a residential and commercial street. This is DN Road. Again, old fort in Bombay. Arcade for shopping, street vendors, ground plus 3, ground plus 4, max, carriageway, same thing happening on the other side. Again, old street, this is the way it was planned. What about the new streets that are coming up in the city, in the public-private partnership city? This is the first example. Okay? This is you see this photograph? This is the podium. 4 stories. You can enter. Usually there's a gate here. So with your car you can enter here. But what happens to the street sections? Look at this street section. Right? 4 or 5 story podium, which is a dead facade. There is no interaction whatsoever. So if you're walking on the street, you see a blank wall. Okay? The pavement will typically be enough for 2 people to walk. Right? Then immediately you will have a road because traffic is most important. It's a fundamental right. Everything else can go for a toss. It's fine. Traffic is the most important thing in our cities today. Should not be, but it is. Right? Everything is planned for cars to move. So if there is a problem, congestion, what do? You remove street vendors and you widen the road. You remove the cycle lane and you widen the road. You remove the pavement and you widen the road. For what? For the cars to move. Right? So this is what happens. So you imagine there is no street life here. The street life exists only for the cars and the vehicles which are using the road. Okay? Another example, this is the mall on Link Road. This is even better. You see what happens here. Again, this road is only for the mall, so this doesn't count. It's a private road. Now you have the mall road, again a mall, so blank wall. There is a garden here. This one. What is this garden for? It's to prevent people from using it. It's a purely ornamental garden. Nobody is going to walk there. But the point is that if you make a garden, nobody will come and sell things. So it's an anti-street vending device. Ornamentation in our cities are to keep the poor out, essentially. Right? So this is what it is. And then you have this little pavement where again, barely 2 people can walk at the same time. And then you have traffic. Right? So this is the new style streets that we have. So what has happened to street life? There is no street life. There is no public life. If you want public life, if you want to, have a good time, you go in the mall, not outside. Okay, and that means that only people who can go in the mall can enjoy public space. For everybody. So a mall is what? According to our graph, it's a club good. It's not a public good. But an open space is a public good. Right? So we have moved our 3 important public institutions, the market, the street, and the public square, the Maidan, inside the mall. where you now have to pay for it to access. You can't access it without paying for it. So that is the privatization of public space. Okay, so now to conclude, I would like to say that you're all going to be architects, planners, urban designers, engineers, whatever. You're in your first year of school. Now, you know, what is the role of the institution, of the university in your life? What are you here for? There are two ways you can think about it. One is that what you're generally taught, and in most institutions in the world, what you're taught is that you're socialized into becoming a cog in the machine, right? Become a professional, find a good job, do your work, earn good money, you know, live your life. That's essentially what most institutions try to do or inculcate. But there's another important role for the university or the institute of learning, which probably you can embark upon, which is to ask tough questions, right? Which is to not accept received wisdom. And maybe that is what you can think about, right? Now, the reason why I'm saying this is that, you know, many of your teachers, like people like me and maybe a little older than me, we got educated in the 60s and 70s and 80s. You know, this was the time when there were songs like, "We don't need no education. We don't need no thought control." Education was thought control, right? Now, the same people who heard those songs when they were students are your teachers. But they don't say that you don't need education. They say you need a lot of education. They don't say education is thought control. They say education is not thought control, right? So something has changed. And you have to ask, what has changed? Why is education thought about so differently? From at one point being thought of as thought control and today being thought of as the most important thing you'll do in life, because otherwise you won't become, you know, you won't go up on the ladder and get your upward mobility and get good jobs and so on. So you have to think about that as well. What really has changed? It's something for us to think about as well. So I would like to end by giving you two maxims that you can take away and think about in the next 4 or 5 years of your education here and maybe in your adult life as well. The first one is a professional one, or you can also say it's a political one, which is this: be very seriously committed to the idea of the public. Okay? The idea of the public is very important because, in fact, for many professions, if you read the Architects Act, what is the first ethical responsibility of the professional? It's not to the client, it's to the public, right? So the public is your primary aim, or should be. So be committed to the public and the idea of the public, and what it is up to you to decide. You know, you can read in the economics textbook, but you can also think that actually the public has a very simple definition, not what the economics textbooks teaches you. A public good is essentially something which, a public good is something which everybody needs. And secondly, it's also in your interest that everybody else has it. Like education. You need education, but it's also in your interest if everybody else has education, right? Because it doesn't take away from your education. In fact, it enhances it. If others are educated as well, your quality of learning improves, right? That's a public good. No doubt about it. Same with health. If others are sick, you can't be healthy. So, that's a public good. If everybody is well housed, you benefit as well, right? So that's a public good. So you don't need to go by the economics definition. You can think about it yourself, right? So, but be committed to the idea of the public. And the second is an intellectual maxim. which is, where'd it go? Oops, disappeared. Well, it's not there. Sorry, something happened. The second maxim is doubt everything. Don't believe anything which is told to you. Doubt everything. Okay? So with these two maxims, I think I'd leave you, and I hope you will have a good, exciting 3, 4, 5 years ahead of you, and even more exciting future. The next few decades are going to be very challenging. You live in probably the most tumultuous times of humankind. So I hope that we all have the ability to confront some of these challenges. I'll leave you at that. I hope you learned something, and thank you very much. What happened to the second maxim? Doubt everything it said. It just disappeared. Anyway, questions, comments? We have time. Yeah. Will you be loud? Well, you know, the Indian Railways, like for instance, take the Indian Railways is a very large system. Now, the Indian Railways has a very vast network. You know, the interesting thing about this network is that it goes to some of the most remotest parts of the country. If this entire system was built in a for-profit model, it would never reach those parts of the country. You know why? It would simply not be profitable. You see, that's the essential difference. Now, I understand your question, that there could be some benefits, which is what I was trying to tell you. A large part of what we call the public system is essentially a PPP system. Like, for instance, I told you a little bit about public housing. You know, like MADA Public Housing. MADA is the housing board in Bombay. Who was building it? They were actually contracts given to private construction companies, right? They were not built by MADA employees. So they were always contracts, but very specific contracts for very small parts of the operation. Now, the control essentially was in the public domain, right? What happens in privatization is the control is transferred to the private entity, right? Now, that is where the problem begins. The problem is not with the, you know, how much of it is public and how much of it is private. The problem is how much of it is in public control and how much of it is in private control, right? So that you have to be careful. Now, like for instance, catering services in Indian Railways. Earlier it was public, now it is private, okay? Fine, you know. The question is very soon, there will be arguments made about certain lines being operated by certain contractors, which is a very different thing now altogether, right? Because then what will happen, like in Bombay, the BST system, which is which was the model of public transport for other cities in India, that is being privatized. They're literally selling routes to private contractors. But you know the funny thing, these contractors are basically getting public revenue. So if I am a bus user, I can pay taxes or I can pay ticket fares, right? Obviously, if I'm buying a public transport ticket, it will be less, it will be more affordable. But the point is not who how much money you're paying. The point is who you're paying the money to. When you pay that money to the public authority, to the BST system, that money goes into subsidizing your service. If you pay user fees to the contractor, it goes in the profits of the contractor. So that's where the difference is, right? So you have to be careful about this, right? There's no point in being dogmatic about it, that it should be all this or all that, right? But you have to think about, essentially, where does the control remain? In public hands or in private hands, right? Well, it's a good question. The trains are overcrowded because they are, you see, there is a way of addressing the overcrowding problem in Bombay's metro, in the suburban rail. Currently, they use a manual signaling system. If they move to an electronic signaling system, they can increase the frequency of trains. If they increase the frequency of trains, you will be able to address some of the problem. But why are they not doing that? That's a more important question. Because a lot of the investment in the city is going in metros, roads, and those kinds of projects. Not in essential services that most people use. You see, buses and rails, most people use. Nobody's investing in them. Everybody's interested in investing tens of, what is the metro master plan, how much the metro is going to, how much money the Maharashtra government is spending on Mumbai metro system? I think 120, 130,000 crores. You can spend 4,000 or 5,000 crores on the suburban railway system and improve its frequency. But that's not being done. You see, the priorities are very clear. The entire orientation of transport in Bombay, in transport infrastructure, is airport, metro, and highway. That is the orientation. It's not bus, rail, and non-motorized transport. It's not that. Okay? So that has changed completely. So a lot of investment in the airport, a lot of investment in metro, a lot of investment in highways, nothing for buses, nothing for rail. That is the reason why it's a problem.
But since the Mumbai metro and many of these road projects, they are primarily public.
Thanks.
Yeah, so.
Hello.
Yeah, I think it's working. It's working.
Yeah. So basically, those are primarily public projects. So like, what's the thought process behind making these projects?
You saw the chart, you saw the diagram. Is the metro a public project? Metro is a mass transit project. It is also public infrastructure. But a large part of it is, like for instance, one line in the metro system in Bombay is operated by Reliance. Okay? But apart from that, the fare structure of the metro is such that only professionals and some sections of the lower middle class can access. People still avoid the metro and take suburban rail, a longer route, because it's cheaper. So spending more time and taking a longer route is cheaper than spending less time and taking a shorter route. Right? That is the problem with the metro. It's a club good. You have access to it only if you are able to pay for it. Anyone else? There's a hand there? No. One more? We just wait for maybe 5 seconds of somebody else. Anyone else before he asks another question? Just to avoid him from asking a question, maybe you should ask a question. No, I think they're very curious to hear your question. Go ahead.
Yeah, so basically climate change, it has a lot, it has a big role in, like, converting public goods to market goods. Yeah, so like, I mean, how would this affect this definition of market goods and public goods? Like, for example, in the example that you said, if you pollute all air, then you can sell clean air. So like that's basically using climate change to make public goods to market goods. So like, is there a situation like wherein due to this climate change, I don't know, the quantity of public goods can be reduced or something like that?
Okay. Again, it's a very counterintuitive question, so thanks for that. It's not that climate change is creating privatization. You see, the privatization is not driven by climate change. It's a political process, right? Now, but what you pointed out is true. There are a whole new range of opportunities that have opened up, which is called, which you can call climate capitalism. Essentially, to benefit from the climate crisis. And you have a whole range of new organizations, startups, entrepreneurial startups. Many NGOs are also kind of pitching for climate change mitigation projects and so on. So there is a whole new market now, Now the problem is essentially a large part of this is highly unproven. I mean, for instance, in Bombay they started putting these urban filters. There's a whole new contract for that. Urban filters to clean the air. How many? They thought of 5 at first. How much air is that going to clean? Right? The point is that if you want clean air, you stop polluting projects. Right? You don't continue to do what you're doing and then try to fix it through a market solution. So, this is, what you're pointing out is true. This is what essentially is going on. A large part of even the global approach of addressing climate change is through market mechanisms. So there's something called carbon credits. I don't know if you've heard of it. So if an industry pollutes in this part of the world, it can plant trees on some other part of the world to compensate for the pollution. So there is a whole kind of, transfer of credits of how much who can pollute and so on. So, a large part of this is market-based responses to climate crisis. Essentially, what is the climate crisis? What is it about? Why is it, why do we have a climate crisis? It's due to something called fossil capitalism. Capitalism which is driven by fossil fuels. So unless you address that, you're going to do very little to address the problem of climate change. All of these things are kind of like, either feel-good measures or some marginal ways of mitigating very, very marginal effects, but not essentially addressing the issue at a structural level. Again, this row is they're sitting closest as well. So.
Why does the government give the project contracts to private companies? Why don't they do it themselves?
Well, I mean, why doesn't the government run the bus system? Why doesn't it build public housing? Why doesn't it do it? This is essentially a question that, it's a complex answer. There is a certain kind of ideological shift, which is basically, and this started, there's a long history, it's a different lecture altogether, but it started in the 70s and 80s, where the idea was that the public sector essentially is inefficient, and the private sector is efficient. It makes profits, but it also is more efficient. This is corrupt, bureaucratic, and inefficient, right? So this has taken hold to a very, very great extent. And amongst, even amongst our planners, city planners, urban planners, government planners, and so on, this is the prevailing belief. Just leave it to the market. The market should provide solutions for everything, right? The state should not do it. The state should only address problems if there are market failures, right? They're called market failures. So if something is, so for instance, for 20% of the population of the city, the poorest of the poor will build housing. But for the rest, the market will take care of. That's the idea. It's that basically things that simply cannot be addressed by the market, only those have to be addressed by the state, right? So for instance, even in public policy, broadly, you have something called the targeted distribution system. Earlier it was universal, meaning everybody was entitled to subsidized food grain. Now the point is that if you had money, you would not, basically use that benefit. But in theory, everybody was entitled. They converted that into a targeted system, which means the first problem is to identify who is deserving. For that, you have to create a whole new bureaucracy, and then issue certificates to people and, do all of that to be able to say you are entitled, you are not, right? It creates a whole new system to identify people with means and people without means and so on. It is the same thing. Only if the market doesn't serve you, if and only then you will be taken, you will get some benefit from the state, otherwise nothing, right? So that is essentially the prevailing notion. The reason why it has happened is a historical argument which you have to go back 2 or 3 decades, and it's a long discussion, so I won't get into that now.
So many people don't prefer using public modes of transport because of the lack of hygiene. So how do you solve that? And that, as a general also
lack of hygiene, meaning?
If you take the public bus. I'm from Bangalore,
I see.
Yeah.
Okay, I get the question. Okay, so a lot of people, why public services seem unhygienic? Very simply, because they are not serviced, because they are not taken care of. They're neglected. They're neglected because they are not invested. Have you used the metro? Do you think it's unhygienic?
Not as much as buses are, but then yes, to a certain extent.
Why?
Suppose the Bangalore metro, it's been in use for quite a few years. I found the Ahmedabad metro slightly more cleaner because that's also got to do with number of people that use it.
It's very simple. If you take care of something, it'll stay clean.
So why doesn't the government appoint I don't know.
They want to cut costs. Very simply. If you're again, take the bus system in Bombay. They want to cut costs. They want to, they're saying that it's running a loss. So they want to cut costs. What do you do? How do you cut costs? Cut maintenance, reduce staff, reduce some of the cleaning staff, the conductor staff, and so on. So what happens? Services deteriorate, right? Buses break down. Some of them catch fire. All of this is going on. Okay? So it's nothing, there is nothing inherent in public transport that makes it unhygienic. It's as you go to any city in the world where public transport works, it is of very good quality because there is money that goes into it. You know how Singapore pays for its public transport system? By making it very expensive for people to use cars. If you buy a car in Singapore, we like to talk about making world-class cities and so on. We don't believe shit, If you want to, how Singapore, first of all, I spoke about housing a little bit. You know how Singapore, 80% of land in Singapore is public land. Only 20% is private land. And if you have a job in Singapore, the public authority will ensure that you get a house. Right? Now, when it comes to transport, if you buy a car in Singapore, if the car costs 5 lakhs in Indian rupees, let's say a 5 lakh rupee car in India, by Singapore standards, it would cost 25 to 30 lakhs. So you're paying the cost of a Mercedes to drive a Swift. Okay? Why? How does that happen? Because they have these, they'll auction the right to use the road in a car. Their licenses have limited licenses. They have 10,000 licenses they issue every year and they auction them. Now all of that money that the government generates by auctioning these very expensive licenses, it uses to improve public transport. Plus it has other means like congestion pricing and parking charges and all of that money, revenue goes into improving public transport. Right, which is why public transport is of such good quality. What they do is they make it expensive to drive cars and they make it very easy and very convenient to use public transport. So people use public transport. No. So, I mean, you also have to, and even the way in which they do land use planning, they integrate housing and transport, and land use and transport. So they use land financing to be able to build infrastructure as well. Right? So, I mean, okay, you want world-class city? Totally, I'm game. Okay? But let's start thinking about that seriously then. That is how they do it. It's not magic. They just do, you know, and it's not even a very anti-market kind of system. Because every 10 years, you have to scrap your car in Singapore. The reason they give is, oh, you know, after 10 years, the car pollutes and all of that. So you scrap your car after 10 years, that means you also buy new cars. It's not like and you upgrade the technology as well, right? So you are not, it's not the idea that you have to continue using your the old car. So they are balancing public interest and the interests of private players as well. But they're doing it very intelligently, not, you know, not in a senseless way. They're doing it very intelligently. And people like to go and live in Singapore. It's not like, you know, nobody says, oh, I don't want to go there because, you know, 80% of land is public housing. Have you heard anyone say that? Actually, most people try to hide the fact that 80% land is public land. Nobody mentions it. You know, they just see the housing. They don't talk about the land. Or they just see the public transport. They don't talk about how expensive it is to own a car. Imagine you put a tax on cars in India. So you see the kind of bad press the government will get if they have a tax on four-wheelers. They will be vilified in the press. You know, you heard that? Heard any news story which says Singapore overprices cars and Singapore government overprices cars? They don't talk about it because it works. So they don't talk about it. Okay, no more questions from these four. Yeah, I can hear you.
TDR as a regulation, so I have two questions regarding it. One is that how much stake, like who has how much stake, like how much does the government intervene and how much does the private company who is involved in it gets the power? And the second is that why in the first place did the government have to bring in this rule of giving such benefits?
Okay. So the TDR system, again, you know, all of the things in Bombay that are done, that benefit private actors are done in the name of the public good. Okay? So for instance, when the slum rehabilitation scheme, the photographs I showed you, was introduced in 95, it was the Shiv Sena at that time came into power. There was already a similar scheme that started in 91, which was the Congress government scheme. But in 95, when Bal Thackeray wanted to get elected, he said, if I get elected, I will give free housing to all slum dwellers in Bombay. And he got elected. Now he had a problem. How do I do that? So he set up a committee, and the committee had, you know, very smart people on it, some leading NGOs, some architects, and so on. And they said, all right, you know, the way to do it is that it should not be, you should not burden the taxpayer. That was a term that was used. So if you don't burden the taxpayer and you want to give free housing to slum dwellers, how do you do it? So the solution was to use land as a resource, as a financial resource, essentially. So then you do the cross-subsidy model. Essentially, you allow the developer to come in, make sale, and use some of the land to rehab the slum dwellers, part of the slum dwellers, always. Then they realize that this cannot work in every place. In some places, there are special constraints. So for instance, Mahul, which I showed you, was in the extreme eastern suburbs. There, the land values are very low. If they build sale, nobody will be interested to come and live there. Again, it's a very polluted site. So what did they do? They introduced this concept of TDR, which is that the landowner could give away the land and would get twice the land area, that much area, as TDR. So they could take the TDR elsewhere and build elsewhere. So it's a kind of a compensation. Instead of giving them money, they're giving them a certificate which says you can build elsewhere this much area. The person who constructed, the builder who constructed those buildings, was given 1.33 times the built-up area as TDR. Right? So this becomes a kind of a compensation to the developer to do what is actually the public sector's responsibility. The state was supposed to build the housing for the poor. It has outsourced it to the developer, and in exchange, instead of money, it gives the developers TDR, right? The right to build elsewhere, essentially. So that then becomes the way in which it is done. Now, a lot of TDR was generated in the redevelopment of slums. A lot of TDR, actually. And in the regulations of Bombay's planning regulations, there is, for any project, you need a TDR component. So you have to buy TDR from the market to be able to do that. So all this TDR that is being generated is then being used up in other parts of the city. So it's a kind of a mechanism that was introduced within the planning system to compensate developers for doing what is essentially the public sector's responsibility. No, there is, see, look, even the Mahul project had some government regulations. So the regulation was that the FSI was 2.5 on site. So they built 2.5 FSI on site, right? That is what but they could have built it differently, but that builder built it with trying to minimize cost, obviously, right? And consume the 2.5 FSI. And so there was some regulation. But the regulations were not stringent enough to ensure that there was enough open space and health and educational facilities, none of that. So there was a lot of relaxation of the planning norms to allow the developer to, build what the developer built, essentially. So there is the problem. If you look at Bombay's planning, it has two systems. It has one system for slum dwellers and people who are going to be rehabilitated. There is another system for everybody else. And for slum dwellers, the norms are highly relaxed. For everybody else, they are still a little better. But that's also going down. So overall, there is a reduction in planning standards.
Funding for projects in Bombay, it's mostly directed towards airports and highways and metro and such. But why is it so undesirable to fund the projects on the other side, that is like the local train and buses, etc.?
So, look, it's difficult to, like our guess, for instance, is very simply that the metro system in Bombay, right? Now, if you look at the metro system performance in most cities in the country, metros don't do really well. Actually, metro ridership in all places where metros have been built has been very poor. I don't think there is any example where the ridership is equal to the projected ridership. Almost everywhere it is less than what was expected. Why is that? Then why are we building the metros? Very simply, the metro, you see infrastructure in Indian cities generally, I mean across the board, is supply driven. It is not based on assessment of demand, which is the reason why you build infrastructure like metros. If it was supply driven, you would realize that what works in the interest of most people is things like surface rail and buses. So you would invest in that. Since it's supply driven, you create the infrastructure, then you wonder about how do I get people to use it. So now what has happened is in metros, all the metro reports say that the ridership, people will move from cars into metros. It doesn't happen anywhere. Ridership switch from cars to metros is minimal. You know where the ridership comes from? From buses and two-wheelers. So what do? You dismantle the bus system so that people have no choice but to use the metro. So you're, in a sense, forcing people by reducing their choice to use the metro system, to shift to the metro system, which is what is happening in Mumbai. There, in many cities where the metro system came in, the BRTS was dismantled so that people start using the metros. If people use buses, why will they use the metros? Right? So you're taking ridership from one place and transferring it to the other. This is the problem of creating supply-driven infrastructure, where you're not thinking about, where you're thinking later about how do you get ridership. Right? This is the reason. Why would you? Why move people from the, you see, now this is a interesting question. Again, this is not, I don't have very clear answers on this, but you can guess, For instance, metros are more attractive. They look, they're huge capital investment. So a lot of people can make money. A lot of concrete can be poured, a lot of steel can be bought, a lot of contracts can be made. Building a, bus lane on an existing road is very easy. Doesn't cost too much. If enough money is not circulating, people can't get, some of it can't be made in that circulation process, right? So if you create a BRTS system in Bombay, you would literally need 2,000 to 3,000 crores to create one lane of all of the major roads into bus lanes. That's all you need to do. No traffic congestion problems. People will use them. There will be more ridership in buses than in the metro. It's a very easy solution. But it will not work because there's not enough money to be made. The metro financing, how it works. JICA, which is the Japanese metro agency. See, metro systems around in the developed world, the demand is almost not there. In the developed world, nobody wants metros. Metros they already have, right? So who wants metros? In the developing world, governments are not rich enough to buy the metros. So what does JICA do? JICA is the Japanese technology. So they are building the metro. But the Japanese government is giving the Indian government a 4% loan, which is a very low interest loan, to do what? To buy metro from its companies. So they are giving you the money and you pay them back to buy the metro technology. Right, so it's a way of selling you a technology that they have and making it juicy enough for you, to take it. So, and now we have a metro program all over the country. Every city is installing metro. Cities who don't have a bus system is suddenly building metros. It's very strange. But this is what is happening essentially. Big capital investment always works better than small, practical, service-oriented projects. Interventions, rather. Wait, forbidden. Take this.
So in some cases, projects, we've seen that in Mumbai, Bridgewala project, the estimated cost was like 400 crores and the actual cost became 1600 crores. So what was the reason behind that, and can we avoid it?
So this is actually it's a global problem. It's not so much an Indian problem. If you look at the literature, global literature on large infrastructure projects, there's a great book on it written by two Swedish sociologists called Mega Projects and Risk, okay, which is essentially talks about how all of these large infrastructure projects overestimate benefits and underestimate costs. And the reason for doing that is obviously to give you a picture that seems to work in terms of cost-benefit analysis. But in the end, you know, if they were doing a good job of estimating costs, these kind of cost overruns would not happen. And then the government always has a very convenient excuse to say why the cost increased. They will say, well, delays due to all of these activists filing PILs. That's their standard excuse. PILs kar diya, project delay ho gaya, iske liye cost badh gaya. You know, actually it's not the case. They are always underestimating costs so that it looks good on paper. These project reports actually, before, you know, they are called DPRs, detailed project reports. They're very interesting reports to read. Lot of jargon, lot of technical jargon. So most people get put off by it. They don't read it because they think it's, you know, some big expert has to read it. Nothing. It's actually nothing like that. You know, for instance, the Coastal Road DPR, it spoke about two alternatives. Like, you know, if it was a supply-driven project, you would do a traffic analysis and you would say, okay, these are the traffic transportation problems, mobility problems in the city, so you need these kinds of projects. And you can address them through this option A, option B, option C, option D. These are the different approaches. This will cost this much, that will cost this much. That is how you will do an assessment, an analysis, right? You know how these DPRs are made? The Coastal Road DPR had two alternatives. What happens if you build the coastal road? And what happens if you don't build the coastal road? That's the two alternatives. And obviously, if you don't build it, all hell will break loose. You know, nobody will be able to move in the city. So you have to build it. This is essentially the argument of the report, right? So it's basically, you know, why the government authority gives the project, gives the writing of these reports to an agency, gives them 500 crores to write it, and essentially says, you know, make it look good. So they make it look good. You know, they don't do a study, you know, a kind of a neutral, balanced assessment of mobility needs. They are doing what is called project justification. They are being paid to justify the project, and they justify the project. Right? That's the reason why you end up with these underestimated cost and inflated benefits.
If government is doing the poor job, they are the ones paying the money, right? So isn't it their loss?
Well, you know, I mean, they are not paying money. You're paying money.
Yeah,
it's your money.
But like government is saying we don't have money to do more projects.
Yeah, that they say. They say all kinds of things. You see, it's, you know, it's a, look, the government doesn't have money. That is true. That is what they say. Okay? In Bombay, they said they don't have money to provide water, sanitation, housing. They don't have money. You know how much money the Bombay Municipal Corporation has in fixed deposits? 92,000 crores. You know how much money it will take to do the entire Dharavi redevelopment plan at government expense? 10,000 crores. But they don't have money. You know how much they're spending for the coastal road? 13,000 crores. Okay, so what makes more sense? Doing Dharavi or doing coastal road? 60,000 people versus 400,000 families. What makes more sense? You see, it's not that it's about what you make your governments do. Governments will do what you make them do. Okay? They are not going to do what, if you think that in their better wisdom they will do things, they will do these things. Governments are powerful institutions. They have interests like all powerful institutions. If you make them work in your interest, they will do that. If somebody else makes them work in their interest, they will do that. Right? So it's not like government is always going to do one thing. No. It will do what you make them do.
Hello, sir. So my question is that nowadays people's mentality is like they want to just build profit. So they will be building these condominiums and apartments and no one will actually be thinking about catering to public goods. So my question is that during this time if someone offers up to do a project that caters to public goods, but they will be criticized somewhat, not much, but so how can we change the mentality of people?
People are building condominiums in the name of public good. They're doing that. Many condominiums are being built, many penthouses. That photograph I showed you, yes. That penthouse, it was a slum rehabilitation project. It's in the public good. Somebody, and you know what the project is called? It's called Imperial Towers. Imperial Towers in the public good, slum rehabilitation. You see, the problem is that the public goods is different from the public good. The public good is, in building the sea link is in the public good. A lot of times when these arguments go to court in PILs and so on, the proponents of the government always says, this project is in public interest, imminent public interest. That is what they say. So in the case of the coastal road, they said the traffic congestion of Bombay is so severe that building the coastal road by violating environmental laws is still in the public interest. You see? So, you can do a lot in the name of public interest. You can invade another country in the name of public interest. That's all rhetoric. The point is what eventually is happening. You have to use you have to ask, that's what I said, right? Don't accept received wisdom. Constantly challenge it, constantly question. And people who are in power are always going to tell you things, and you have to challenge them so that you get closer to what is really going on, right? One last question? Okay, go ahead.
So there's lots of irreparable damage that's been done, like all that's been mentioned. So considering the fact that the people in power do want to change that, and so what do they do? Like, what are some steps that can be taken?
Okay, so what can be done about these projects which have already been built? You can always retrofit them. You're all designers, right? And you're going to be designers, architects, planners, industrial designers, I don't know, furniture, I don't know, whatever designers. Designers can do anything. You can retrofit them. You can make them something else, right? It's never too late. Sometimes you can also pull them down. You know what they did in Paris? There was a freeway which was built over the river at some point in time in the 60s when they were all emulating the American model of making highways everywhere. So they built a highway there. Then they realized it's a stupid idea. So they dug up that highway. They restored the river. They did that. Now it's a nice public space, mostly pedestrian. You can do that. there's a very famous project in New York called the High Line, which was the old kind of elevated railway track. They made a nice elevated garden there. Now people take walks there. It becomes a overhead kind of public space, come pedestrian plaza, you know, all of that. You can do so many things. You know, you can transform this infrastructure into something else. Nothing changes. I mean, nothing stops you from doing it. But to make that happen, you will have to do an enormous amount of fighting. You know, struggle. Because you have to change so many people's mindset, which is not easy. You know, you could say, you can suggest an idea, oh, you know, let's retrofit this coastal road and make it a nice public promenade. Very good idea. But to get people to actually politically implement it will require years and years of hard work. So that is the tough part. Design is easy. Politics is tough. Okay. You have a question? Oh, you're just holding the mic. Okay. All right. So, shall we? So thank you so much. It was great interacting with you guys.